Stop. Good afternoon, everyone, and many thanks for joining us today for our Food for Thought seminar. My name is Anne-Marie Staunton, and I'm part of the Food for Thought team. Before I introduce you to today's speaker, I would like to remind you of some housekeeping rules. Since we're on Teams Live, you will not be able to unmute your microphones to ask questions. We do, however, welcome any questions or comments you may have, and you can post these into the Q&A chat, which should appear to the right of your screen. Please do note that any questions will be picked up at the end of the presentation. Today's seminar is being recorded and the seminar recording will be circulated in due course. For today's seminar, I would like to provide a very warm welcome to Dr. William Hallman. He's an experimental psychologist at the State University of New Jersey. His research examines public perceptions of risk, attitudes and behaviours in relation to food safety, with a focus on improving risk and science communication. So, without further ado, and from all of us at the Food for Thought team, we hope you enjoy the seminar, and I will now pass you over to Bill to begin his presentation.
Great, thanks so much. And you should be able to see my slides. So let's go ahead and get started. So I'm Bill Hallman. I'm professor in the Department of Human Ecology at Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey. And I'd like to talk to you today about perception of food risks and benefits and the use of heuristics. My area of expertise is risk perception and risk communication, especially related to food safety issues. And I've spent the last 35 years doing research in this particular area. So putting together this presentation was really a challenge in what not to say. So let's go ahead and get started. So first of all, as a psychologist, one of the first things that I was taught in grad school is perception is reality. It doesn't really matter what the objective science says. What matters is what people, think is going on. And so to effectively influence how people think about risks and benefits, you need to understand how people perceive them. We know that many of the hazards that kill people are not the ones that people necessarily worry about. That's particularly true with respect to food safety issues. One of the real struggles we have in getting people to practice better food safety is they don't necessarily believe that the hazards are there. And indeed, one of the challenges that we really have with respect to food safety issues and food in general, frankly, food selection in general, is that most of the risks and benefits associated with foods are invisible. You really can't see them. You have to believe that they are there, or you have to trust someone else to tell you that they're there or are not there. The fact that the risks and benefits are invisible allows us to either ignore them, which we frequently do with respect to food safety, or to exaggerate them, which is often what we do with respect to the perceived benefits of some foods. Think about superfoods, for example. So my area of expertise, which is risk communication, I think of as making the invisible visible. How do we help people understand what's there that they cannot see in ways that gets them to take action? So with respect to risk perception and benefits perception, there are really two components. There are cognitive components, that is the way that we think about risks and benefits, our mental models of how they work, the likelihood of the consequences, the social contexts around them, who benefits, why, who's at risk, and why. So the first component is how we think about risks and benefits. The second are affective components, the feelings and emotions that we have around particular issues. And when we're talking about risks, we're often talking about things like disgust and dread and anger and fear and worry. But when we begin to talk about benefits, we begin to think about pleasure and happiness and satisfaction and these kinds of things. We could spend an entire hour just talking about this piece. I will not. So let's move on. So many of my colleagues, many psychologists and many of the economists I work with firmly believe that affect or emotion is really the byproduct of cognition. That is, people evaluate the information they're given, which then leads to an overall affective reaction. In sum, we think first and then we feel. I like to joke that the people who believe that have never been in love, because that's clearly not how we look at, every risk and benefits that is out there. And indeed, emotion or affect can come first. It often does come first. And so we feel, and then we try to explain why we feel the way we do. And we'll look for information that actually is consistent with the way we feel or justify the way that we feel. We also know that how we feel can also direct future cognition. So we make up our minds that we like or we don't like something, and then we look for information that confirms that in the future. Food and affect are inextricably linked as well. I do work on other kinds of environmental risks, climate risks, for example, and in many ways, food is very different. And I probably don't need to convince anyone in this audience that that is true. If you think about the way that food connects with so many elements of our lives, nurturing, health, culture, religion, social status, values, identity, they're all connected to emotional reactions. And again, we could spend an hour just making those particular connections, but I will move on. It's also worth pointing out that, emotion is so inextricably linked with food. We eat to make ourselves feel better physically and also emotionally. We use food to make ourselves feel better. Food is also really different from a lot of the other risks that we take a look at. And it's worth saying that, a lot of the research on how people think about risks and benefits comes from outside the realm of food. It comes from environmental contamination research, for example. It comes from research related to nuclear waste. Clearly food is different from those kinds of problems. And one of the ways that food is different is that, unlike other kinds of risks, we literally and figuratively internalize those risks and the benefits that we associate with food and drink. We take them in. They become part of us. And of course, we reinforce this culturally. You are what you eat. But because we internalize them, perceived food hazards are often seen as objects of disgust. And one of the things that we have evolved with is this kind of trigger reflex to help us avoid things that are off-putting. So it's one of the ways that emotion can come first. So, this helps to explain why things that are considered delicacies or perfectly fine in one culture can be object of disgust in another. It's culturally constrained. And I will say that I have actually eaten several of the insects on this plate. There was beer involved, however. So, we know that affect is inextricably linked with food. It's not surprising that food marketers know this as well. And if you look at food advertising, so much of it relies on affect. So here's an example of Burger King and a hamburger that's titled Whopper Lust. It's all about emotion. It's all about, doesn't this look good? Don't you really want this? There is no cognition. There's no nutrition facts. There's nothing here convincing you intellectually that this would be a good thing to have for lunch. It's all emotion. But when you think about the kinds of things that we do as scientists and as regulators and competent authorities, we're all about cognition. If you think about nutrition education, it entirely relies on cognition in telling people, what's good for them to eat and what they should avoid. Activist messages about GMOs. I've done work on how the public thinks about GMOs since the very early 1990s, have been following this forever. You know, there is a stark difference between the way people who are anti-GMO communicate. This is a really good example. It's a short phrase and it is very clear what the emotion is. It relies on short phrases to communicate gist. What do? Here's classic GMO education, which relies on cognition. Very complex, very scientific, and it relies on you understanding how it works to try and combat this. Similarly, a lot of the food safety messages we put out rely on cognition, but many advocates' messages rely on affect. So again, short images or short phrases that capture the gist of a message. Unsafe behavior equals unsafe food. Skull and crossbones in the tomato. If you don't wash your hands after using the bathroom, you're a disgusting human being. I mean, that pretty much gets to the heart of it, but a very different approach than what we do and perhaps can do as scientists. We see the same thing with respect to pesticides related to foods. These rely on affect. Again, sort of short images, short phrases, images to the point that get to the gist and are memorable. And again, because this is not new to anyone, people will use framing effects to help focus on that emotion. So this is the Environmental Working Group, which is in the US, which is highlighting what they call their annual Dirty Dozen list, which are fruits and veggies with the most pesticide residues. And then they have an adjoining Clean 15 list, which are the ones with the least pesticide residues. What I want you to focus on is, first of all, they don't tell you how much of the pesticide is there or whether it's over MRLs or is a problem. But what they do is they frame it in terms of dirty and clean, which is a very quick way to get to people and their emotions. It is in fact a kind of heuristic that is useful in understanding whether something is good or bad. Again, going back to disgust. We don't eat things that are dirty because they're disgusting. They may harm us. What do we do in response? The counterarguments rely on cognition. So this is a reaction, the number of servings a child could eat in one day without any effect from pesticides, even at the highest residue levels recorded. This can be effective, but fundamentally, it's very difficult to fight affect with cognition. So indeed, one of the key mistakes we often make as communicators about food safety and the risks and benefits associated with foods is not dealing with emotion, failing to be empathetic and acknowledging emotions when we're answering questions from the public, for example. Our tendency, I was taught as a scientist to stick to the facts and to exclude any emotional content. We are objective. We are not subjective. We have science, we don't have emotion, so we stick to the facts. But unfortunately, that isn't necessarily the most effective way of getting across to people. We just can't rely on communicating the science to change people's minds. We do need to do a better job of explaining facts. Absolutely. And I spent a lot of my time in research trying to do that, to help people understand what the objective facts actually are. But I also know that I need to go beyond that, that's not typically enough to get people to change their minds or their behaviors. Now, having spent a fair amount of time on emotion, I do want to say that cognition really does matter. And your mantra for today is mental models matter. Mental models matter. Mental models matter. How people think absolutely matters. The problem, of course, is we can't know everything as individuals, and that we often have an incomplete mental model of how things work or why they work that way. I do a lot of survey research, like many of you, on what people know and what they do with respect to different kinds of foods and food safety. What I see over and over again is that people overestimate what they think they know. The problem, of course, is we don't know what we don't know, so we're unlikely to seek information to fill in gaps in our knowledge that we don't know we have. And because we don't know what we don't know, and we overestimate what we think we know, we're unlikely to recognize misinformation. And in fact, we will readily fill in our mental models with any available information that is plausible, that kind of makes sense, and connects with what we think we already know, including facts that are incorrect. And I'll also point out here, as more and more of the world's population moves from agricultural areas to urban areas, people begin to know less and less about how food is grown and produced. In some of our early surveys for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, we asked people how much they thought they knew about how food is grown and produced in the United States. And ironically, people who lived in cities told us they knew more than people who lived in agricultural areas. Again, people don't know what they don't know. So based on this, how do we decide what foods to eat? Well, number one, and pretty non-negotiable, except for some young men, this is very gendered, some young men who will eat anything on a dare. New food products have to be considered safe to consume. Something that you encounter for the first time, you have to believe that it's safe before you put it in your mouth. For new food products, one of the things I'm doing right now is looking at appropriate nomenclature for cell-cultured meat, poultry, and seafood products. So looking at acceptance of cell-based meats. For new food products like cell-based meats or precision fermentation or plant-based meats, regulatory approval based on science is critical. And that approval, of course, has to use best practices, open and transparent processes, engaging stakeholders. Again, I probably don't need to convince this audience of that. But what's obvious is that regulatory approval is used as a heuristic by people, as a shortcut to know that a food product or process is safe. Now, it's not a guarantee that people will believe that that is true, but if it's not true, then people are really skeptical. So, what does the government say about this? What do the regulatory authorities say about this? Have they looked at it? I'll also add that consistency across regulatory authorities is really important to establish and maintain trust in the safety of new foods, based on new ingredients and processes. When there is inconsistency across regulatory authorities between the US and the EU, for example, consumers begin to become very skeptical of the process. And they will ask, if regulatory authorities across the world are all using the same science and they're all using the scientific process, how can they come to different conclusions? They begin then to question the motivations of the people involved in the regulatory process, and then essentially say, well, if the scientists can't agree, well, then who can I trust? Who should I trust? And unfortunately, the answer is many who are unqualified to provide truthful information. And often what we'll do is we'll just go on our own intuition and eat what we care to eat. So in addition to foods needing to be perceived as safe, as sort of non-negotiable, foods also have to be affordable, accessible, and culturally appropriate. People have to be able to get to them, to pay for them, and they have to be seen as fitting with the culture. And I'll just take a second as a side note to say, not everybody wants to try new foods, and that there is comfort in eating the familiar. We refer to this in psychology as food neophobia. There's a scale that we use to measure this. Perhaps you have used this as well. It is very clear it's not just children who don't want to try new foods. I have a sister-in-law who in the last 73 years has never eaten a piece of fish. She's just not interested, right? She eats essentially the same 7 things and has done so since she was 7. So it's not just kids. All right. So how do we decide whether to try new foods? Well, some food choices are driven really by a cognitive focus on nutrition. I have an adult son who is very fond of these kinds of protein supplement shakes, and he is fond of making me angry when I prepare a gourmet meal by saying, "Dad, food is fuel." No, food is not fuel. Food is so much more than that. But for him, it doesn't really matter. It's really about the nutritional content of the foods. And there are nutrition apps, many of them available, where you can track the number of calories, the various nutrients that you can consume. A lot of diet programs use these kinds of things. I had a graduate student who earned his PhD looking at these particular apps. And, the spoiler alert is many of them don't actually convey good nutrition advice. But people are kind of stuck on this. They don't, again, the nutrients are invisible, the benefits are invisible. This is something that they trust to make the invisible visible. So some choices are driven by cognition, but so many of our food choices are driven by hedonics, our experiences of pleasure and displeasure based on the way that food looks, the way that it smells, the way that it tastes, its textures. And of course, our past hedonic experiences guide our future expectations. If we didn't like something the first time we tried it, we're unlikely to try it again. And that may be something that you tried as a child. Brussels sprouts, for example, were not high on my list. I was not willing to try them as an adult until I got roasted Brussels sprouts in a restaurant, and now they're a favorite. So we also anticipate pleasure by observing other people. And that's why, if any of you have children, I have 3 of my own who have all survived to adulthood, why you try to mimic or provide good examples to your kids about eating, vegetables, for example. If you've got a nasty look on your face when you eat the Brussels sprouts, your kid's not going to eat them. We anticipate what will not be pleasurable by observing others, and that's kind of the lesson here. If mom doesn't like it, well, then I'm going to be skeptical too. And again, this goes through adulthood. What other people eat around us and the people we respect, what they endorse, influences what we are willing to try. I have a niece who insists on sharing everything she eats on Instagram. I don't know why she feels compelled to do this, but she does. And it is possible. I try to tell her to enjoy a meal without taking a picture of it. But this is, how we do it these days. And, we know that what other people are willing to try and what those around us are eating, influences our own choices. If you had said 40 years ago that sushi would be something that many, many people would eat in the United States, you would have been told that you were nuts. There's several interesting accounts of how the world began to eat sushi, which are really kind of interesting from a cultural perspective. But the bottom line is it began to be seen as something chic and something that smart people did. Now, again, the main thing is risks and benefits are invisible. And when things are invisible, we try to maintain the illusion of control through a variety of means so that we can continue making good decisions and live our lives. Again, invisibility and food safety, here's an issue. We rely on visual and olfactory cues to know what's safe and what is not. And, many people believe that if it looks or if it smells clean, there are no bacteria present. Again, we've done work for USDA where this clearly comes out. The problem is that most people don't know that spoilage bacteria, which is responsible for bad taste and odors, are not a reliable indicator of pathogenic bacteria, which is responsible for foodborne illness. Now, those bacteria like to live in the same places and in the same conditions, but they're not the same. People don't know this, and they believe that if it smells okay or looks okay, then there's nothing wrong. This helps to explain, I've done work on food recalls, for example, why people will say, oh yeah, no, I knew the ice cream was recalled, but I'd already eaten half of it anyway, and so I ate the other half. It was fine. So how do we maintain this illusion of control? One way is through trusted others, through ingredient labels, health claims, date codes, allergen warnings. These are all ways that we endeavor to make sense of the risks and the benefits around us. But this is sort of official communication, and we've come to trust these things. Similarly, government marks of inspection or quality on meat products. Protected designation of origin. I'm living in Rome right now. The DOP label is something that I look for to make sure that I'm getting, Italian products to try. There are other trusted others, religious authorities, halal and kosher compliance, for example, is something that people who belong to those communities look for. But interestingly, in the US, many consumers will also look for kosher marks as an indication of better quality. So they're not keeping kosher, but they see it as an indication of better quality. We also depend on other proxies to communicate what economists refer to as credence attributes. So again, these sort of invisible attributes. So things like brand and familiarity and visual cues are important. One of the reasons that the Impossible Burger became popular in the United States is because Burger King basically began to carry it as part of their menu. And we'll talk a bit in a minute about health halos, but people believe that it's plant-based, and so it's better for them. And I'm convinced that people bought plant-based Whoppers and then a large fries to offset their good behavior. So, the fact that a brand was willing to put its weight behind something matters. We use color as an attribute to identify the ripeness of foods, to identify the quality and safety of foods. People often improperly use color to identify how well cooked foods are. Ladies and gentlemen, please use a meat thermometer if you invite me to your home. We use color of food to anticipate the taste of foods, for example. I like this little note here that, red delicious apples are certainly not delicious. They're red, they're just not delicious. And what's interesting, again, from the psychology of food, is that color and flavor associations become conditioned, which is why that when colors are incongruent with preconditioned expectation, there's a problem. It's one of the reasons why the ill-fated Crystal Pepsi did not take off, because people did not expect a clear liquid to taste like a cola. So we talked about food being chosen based on cognition, on trusted sources, and hedonics. Many choices are also made based on food rules, kind of heuristic, a kind of shortcut, which is a clue that something is true. And we know that people are open to simple heuristics, which again capture the gist. Short phrases or small pictures that identify and communicate gist. Michael Pollan is perhaps best known for his food rules, things like eat organic, whole foods are best, eat food, not too much, mostly plants, easy to remember, they make sense, they're plausible, even if they're not always correct. My favorite rule is this one: don't eat breakfast cereals that change the color of the milk. It's intuitively plausible, and most of these heuristics depend on intuitive plausibility. What he's trying to get across, which is don't eat cereals with artificial colors. And that's sort of the gist here, but there's no science behind, avoiding breakfast cereals that change the color of the milk. It's not something I would advise as a member of the Department of Nutritional Sciences. We're all familiar with the paleo diet: no grains, no glutens, no legumes, no fun, I would argue, no dairy. And again, it's intuitively plausible. The idea is that you eat things that your ancestors ate. You eat things that you were designed to eat. If you think hard about it, there's a reason that we became agricultural societies. And the paleo diet, people do lose weight, and then they become proselytizers for the paleo diet and become extremely annoying. There are lots of other things, and let's go through these very quickly. Nutrient content as a heuristic. I have a graduate student now who's finishing her dissertation looking at health halos around protein labeling. Simply saying that this is a protein cereal leads people to believe that it is healthier than it actually is. So it carries other nutritional benefits other than protein. And in fact, in the United States and most other developed countries or high-income countries, protein is not the problem. Consumption of adequate protein is typically not the problem. Similarly, high in fiber communicates something to people that creates a kind of health halo. Organic, natural, and local is used as a heuristic. I help to run a farmer's market in New Brunswick, New Jersey, which is where Rutgers is located. People will come to the farmer's market, and everything we have is local, but almost nothing is organic. And people are constantly looking for organic produce, and will say things like, well, if it's organic, I don't need to wash it. So it carries meaning beyond what it was intended to mean. Non-GMO is a heuristic, including, labels on products that couldn't possibly be GMO, including fine pink salt. Again, it conveys something about the quality and the safety and the naturalness of a product that may or may not be true. People use the label that something is vegetarian or vegan as a heuristic, thinking that if it is essentially vegetarian, then it must be better for you, regardless of the ingredients. Plant-based extends from this as a heuristic. Again, people think that if it's plant-based, it is better for you. And in fact, I'm convinced that many people believe that if it's plant-based, which we all know essentially is they're using a refined pea protein, they believe that they're getting all of the nutritional benefits from eating plants, from eating a salad, which is clearly not the case. We see lots of products that make pitches to real ingredients, made with real fruit, real cheese, real milk, as opposed to artificial. This is my favorite, made with real ingredients, as opposed to what exactly? Perhaps artificial ingredients, but metaphysically, if it's not made with ingredients, it doesn't exist. Clean label is a new one that's being used as a heuristic, demanding a return to real food and transparency through authenticity, familiar, natural, simple ingredients that are easy to recognize, understand, and pronounce. No artificial ingredients or synthetic chemicals. A short list of ingredients that people can recognize is what clean label is all about. Contrary to that, we're beginning to see ultra-processed as a heuristic, and lots of misinformation. Bill Gates wants you to eat ultra-processed goop. What's in ultra-processed fake meat? It's being thrown around as something that one should avoid. And how to communicate about ultra-processed is not an easy thing. It's not clear what we should be saying about it. And we can talk more about that. People use pre-washed as a heuristic. If it's pre-washed, then it's clean and it's healthy for me, despite the fact that one of the recalls that got me started looking at food safety issues actually involved pre-washed spinach. So just because it says it's on, because it says it's washed on the label doesn't necessarily mean that it is clean. Increasingly, animal welfare is being used as a heuristic. Again, I'm working on cell-cultured meat products. This is a big sell, that you don't have to slaughter animals in order to get the same proteins, the same nutritional qualities, and perhaps the same culinary experience. Fair trade, similarly, is being used as a heuristic. We have animal welfare. We also have, the welfare of the people who are involved in making the products and growing them. Sustainable is beginning to be used more and more as a heuristic. Again, one of the things I'm seeing with cell-cultured seafood is you don't actually have to catch predator fish, for example, large tuna, which are under pressure. You could potentially make cell-cultured seafood and reduce fishing pressures. So this is a big deal. And I want to end with, we learn about lots of food risks as consumers through implicit comparisons. Again, we could spend an hour on this, but here's my current list, which I refer to as what is free is best. You see all kinds of labels: pesticide-free, antibiotic-free, cage-free, clone-free, slave-free, salt-free, and so forth. My favorite one, of course, is chemical-free, which again means that metaphysically the product does not exist. I get what they're trying to say. It's not tested on animals or doesn't have artificial chemicals, but as a communication, it kind of falls short. The key thing is that when we, as consumers, see that a product is free from something and it costs more, then we assume that taking that out of the product is actually healthier for us and worth the extra money. So we learn about these risks in comparison to other products with these particular things. And we assume that whatever it's free from must be a bad thing. And that's not always the case. So here are the take-home messages. Perception is reality. Perception is a function of cognition and affect. And in making decisions about what to eat, affect often wins. We then justify how we feel with cognition. We explain why we feel the way we do after the fact. And the risks and benefits associated with food are invisible, but in order to maintain control, we rely on information from trusted others about things that we can't see. And we often rely on intuitively plausible heuristics and rules that in fact may or may not be true. But that is human nature. As we begin to communicate, improve our communications about the risks and benefits associated with foods, we have to keep these in mind. And with that, this is my contact information. Again, I'm a professor with the State University of New Jersey, Rutgers. Part of my job is to answer people's questions. So if you'd like to, reach out to me, that's fine. Or if you'd like to complain, that's fine too. This is where you can reach me, and I'll turn it back over to Anne-Marie.
Anne-Marie, could you just unmute? Sorry. Thanks so much, Bill, for a fantastic presentation. It was really interesting. You've given us some excellent insights in what we need to be considering when planning our risk communications. We've got quite a few questions in the chat, and one that piqued my interest was in social media. In my family at home, we often have some strange questions coming up, and one of the questions I ask straight away is, where has this information come from? So is there any research regarding the impact of social media on people's perceptions of risk?
Absolutely. How much time do you have? We rely on social media to learn a lot about the world, and for good and for bad. And, one of the ways that, again, we could spend another hour just on misinformation and disinformation and taking that apart. Part of the problem with the way that we kind of explain the world around us, I didn't get a chance to talk about motivated reasoning. That was a slide I took out so I could meet my mark of 40 minutes. But what we know in psychology is that once we make up our minds about something, either sort of cognitively or emotionally, we will look for information that's consistent with what we already believe. We will ignore information that's inconsistent with what we already believe. And when we find information that's inconsistent with what we already believe or what we've already done, and we can't ignore it, we will twist it in ways to make it consistent with what we already believe and what we've already done. Basic motivated reasoning. Oh, and by the way, we often get upset with the people who try to provide corrective information to tell us that we're wrong. Anyone who's had a child knows this. So the issue with motivated reasoning is it gets amplified through social media. So a lot of the misinformation sticks because it is both plausible and connects with what we think we already know. It gets amplified by social media because we tend to be connected with a small number of people. If you look at our social media accounts, unless you're Beyonce, you've probably got, maybe 100 people that you're connected to, that you pay attention to. And generally speaking, those are people that you have something in common with. And so they think like you. One of the great things about social media is you can unfriend people. And the issue, of course, is that we typically choose our friends based on our common interests and, and our common outlooks on the world. When somebody doesn't agree with the way that we think, we sort of lose them as friends. You can't necessarily do that with relatives, but under certain circumstances, you can. So the point is that a lot of the information you're seeing on social media, you're inclined to agree with because you're friends with people who are going to push that information that you already agree with. We also tend to only look at social media channels that reinforces what we already believe. And so there's a kind of filter bubble and an echo chamber that simply reinforces, unfortunately, a lot of the nonsense that's out there. So it's difficult to kind of reject that misinformation. Again, we could spend a whole hour on this or more.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
So our next question is probably on a similar vein about sort of where or how you believe the information. So it says it's interesting that even when we explain the difference between spoilage and pathogenic bacteria and how this works with the sniff test, people are often not swayed. How would you explain this behavior?
How would I explain the behavior, or how would I correct the behavior?
I think it's probably a two-parter, isn't it?
Yeah, okay. So I would explain it again through motivated reasoning. Many of us grew up using the sniff test to decide whether something was good to eat or not. My father did that. He kind of modeled that behavior. And so we believe that it's true, that it's acceptable, it's what everyone does. And so, when you are trying to convince me otherwise, that something I can't see may in fact be a problem, I am going to be skeptical. It also depends on, who you're talking to as well. I've done a fair amount of work with people who are food insecure, and it's very difficult often to get people who are food insecure to discard food, particularly if they can't see that there is an issue with it. And so, particularly older individuals, we did some work with Meals on Wheels in the US, And we went through their cabinets and found things from the Eisenhower administration. I mean, people are just reluctant to throw away food that they think someone can eat. So there's this sort of natural reluctance to want to discard food that people are inclined to believe is okay. They've seen other people model that behavior. They believe everybody does it. And many people, unfortunately, don't really have a good mental model of foodborne illness to begin with. We've done, again, work for USDA, and it is really apparent that most Americans can't recognize the symptoms of foodborne illness when they themselves have it. So if you don't know that you have been made ill as a result of foodborne illness, people say, oh, I've got a 24-hour flu, or something didn't agree with me, it's a digestive problem. No, you gave yourself food poisoning. But people don't know the symptoms of foodborne illness. They're unwilling or unable to connect their own actions to those symptoms. And so there's no feedback loop at all. And so people continue to engage in the same bad behaviors, even when engaging in a simple behavior might be helpful to them. How's that?
Very good explanation. Thank you. Just moving on. So someone's asked about how you can overcome food neophobia with children. So giving food, especially they've stated fruit and veg. I once heard that something like 14 exposures may help to overcome, but I'm not sure that is correct, is what they've said.
Well, that's a really good question. And I have, as I said, 3 children, one of whom was a very picky eater. And I would give you 2 pieces of advice. One is to model the behavior yourself. And if you've got other children, have them model for the picky eater. And often that can solve the problem. Repeated exposures can solve the problem as well. But honestly, your children are going to survive if they don't eat the spinach. And often it becomes a point of contention, and many parents spend too much time trying to force their kids to eat something that they don't want to eat, and it just creates additional problems beyond nutrition. How's that for diplomacy?
Excellent. Like my brother won't eat peas anymore, and I've only just liked sprouts, so I am a big fan of roasted sprouts now as well. Someone's asked about supernormal stimuli. Would you like to comment on supernormal stimuli in promoting and selling processed foods?
I'm not sure what supernormal stimuli are.
I don't know what that is.
I have a hard time answering that one. Sorry. Maybe there's another name for it.
Yeah. Okay. We'll wait for that. Do we know if people know the difference between ultra processed foods and processed foods, and what do we know about people's behavior in this space?
I don't have hard data on that. It's an interesting empirical question, but I'll go out on a limb based on all of the research I've done on people's ability to identify other things and say, no, probably not. And even if they can, it's unclear what processed and ultra processed should signal.
Yeah, still lots of research in that area.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Are there any particular foods that people more frequently avoid than others because of their perceived risk? For example, chicken, because they might worry about salmonella.
Again, there's no the public, there's no the consumer, there are multiple segments. And, what those specific segments avoid is often unique to that segment. Typically, the problem is trying to get people to avoid risky foods and convincing them that they should avoid it rather than the other way around. One possible difference is done some work on consumption of seafood while pregnant or nursing and for small children. And we do see that many women are avoiding seafood while pregnant or nursing. And many are avoiding seafood while there's the possibility they might become pregnant. And this is actually kind of a problem. And of course, one of the reasons that they're doing that is they've been told that they should not eat seafood or they should reduce the amount of seafood they eat to avoid mercury. But the flip side of that is it's a very complex message. If you avoid seafood, you don't get the omega-3s, you don't get the other essential fatty acids. And, in many societies, it's mom who still decides what the family is going to eat. And so if women in the family give up seafood, it means the entire family has given up seafood. And, and they're not getting the benefits. This is one of the more complex messages we have to get across to people that, yeah, you should avoid certain species of seafood that are high in methylmercury and other problems, but that doesn't mean giving up seafood altogether. You need to look for seafood that is high in omegas and low in methylmercury, but that's not an easy message, and we're still sort of trying to get that across.
Okay, yeah, thanks. I think we've just got time for one last question, though it's quite a specialist question, specialist area, so we'll give it a go. Do you have any advice on how best to deal with avoidant/restrictive food intake disorder that goes beyond pickiness? My daughter would choose to starve rather than eat the food she didn't like the smell, texture, or taste of.
Mm-hmm. So I usually say at the beginning of my talks that as an experimental psychologist, I'm a researcher and not a clinician, and I'm not allowed to give clinical advice. So I'm going to pass on that one at the risk of being wrong. So
just got some more comments, sorry.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think is the main reason for the difference in, for example, approved additives in different countries?
What is the reason?
Yeah.
Being diplomatic. There are pressures from consumers and consumer groups for regulatory authorities to not approve particular additives based on their particular interests. There may, in fact, be some differences in level of acceptance and in acceptance of various levels of risk, but the science doesn't differ. What may differ is consumption patterns, and there may be some reasons for different regulatory authorities to have lower levels of certain kinds of things in foods simply because their consumers eat a lot more of whatever those foods are. There's a scientific reason to do that. But people's skepticism really is around regulatory authorities protecting markets or manufacturers or vested interests, which is why we need an open and transparent process so that consumers and advocates can be reassured. They can see the information that was considered and kind of follow along with the decision-making process.
Yeah, no, that's really valuable. Thank you. So the last question then, in your opinion, what future changes within agriculture present the most significant risk?
Significant risk? Well, that's a good question. As somebody who works with Rutgers Cooperative Extension helping farmers, there are an ever-changing number and type of pesticides. Neonicotinoids, is that, am I pronouncing that correct? Are a concern for bees in particular. That's one thing that I'd like to see reduced. But it's not what farmers are doing that I think poses the greatest risk. It's really the things around them. So one of the things I work on is climate change and, salt intrusion, flooding, warming, all of these things I think are a greater risk to the food supply than any individual act that farmers are engaged in.
Brilliant. Thank you, Bill. That's been very insightful, and it's great to see you today.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
You're very welcome. Before we close, I just want to flag that if you're not already on our Food for Thought mailing list and you would like to join it, you can do so via the sign up link that I'll just post in the chat. The seminar recording will also be available on our YouTube channel, which I'll also post in the chat. If you have any questions or feedback, you can email us at foodforthought@food.gov.uk. And if you are based within the FSA, you can search our page on the intranet for more updates. So thank you all for joining, and have a lovely rest of the day. Thanks. Bye.